I had a little bit of bigger section, but I just focused in on verses 33 through 46 with the parable of the tenants. So I'm just going to read some verses, and then I'll just talk, and then we'll keep going. So Jesus says, "Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and moved to another place. When the harvest time approached, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect his fruit." This is the second parable of three that Jesus is speaking to the leaders of Israel. And to start from the very beginning, it is very obviously echoing Isaiah 5, 1 through 7. So I'm going to read the first couple of verses, and you're going to see how this kind of sets the framework for what Jesus is going to say. And it's actually a love song, or more like a poem. And it starts like this. Isaiah says, "I will sing for the one I love, a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a wine press as well. Then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit." And I think, so starting off here, we already have the echo of Isaiah, who's speaking and communicating about the Lord's vineyard. So it belongs to the Lord, and the vineyard represents Israel, or the people of Judah. And the vineyard is only producing bad grapes or bad fruit. And so amongst Israel, Isaiah is kind of communicating about how the nation of Israel, who is in covenant union with God, is commissioned by God to be a vehicle or in a light to other nations for like righteousness and justice, but they never produce good fruit. And so that was kind of what they were to steward, and they failed. And so if you look at verse 7 of Isaiah 5, it says this. It says, "The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel, and the people of Judah are the vines he delighted in. And he looked for justice, but he saw bloodshed, for righteousness, but he heard cries of distress." And so I think Jesus is echoing this poem is going to be a helpful cue for those who have the ears to listen. And I also want to just note that this was going to be this practice of getting a vineyard, purchasing a vineyard, and then having tenants or laborers that are hired to come work the vineyard. That was a very familiar concept in the time of Jesus. Many people had that standard practice in the Mediterranean. And actually, some of the audience, some of the Jewish leaders, were probably had a farm or some kind of vineyard as well and had this. And so it's neat to see how the words from Isaiah 5 and the parable Jesus tells are very closely paralleled. So I'm going to keep going. Verses 35 to 39. "The tenants then seized his servants. They beat one, they killed another, and stoned a third. Then he sent other servants to them, more than the first time, and the tenants treated them the same way. And last of all, he sent his son to them. 'They will respect my son,' he said. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to each other, 'This is the heir. Come, let's kill him and take his inheritance.' So they took him and threw him out of the vineyard, and they killed him." Which this is crazy. Like, these tenants all of a sudden start getting very violent, which Keener kind of mentions that that's a very startling kind of turn of events. These tenants who are hired to labor in the field have all of a sudden started killing the servants of the landowner. And so the language of beat, killed, and stoned, you see it seems very severe. And a lot of the times, especially in parables and in allegory, different things have different meanings, right? And so, like in the same way, the love poem was about Israel being like a vineyard. Some people read this parable and see that the servants who are being sent from the landowner are like the prophets. And so the language of stoning almost references or almost kind of echoes the same way that Jeremiah was supposedly died. And so these servants and this multitude of servants who are coming are being mistreated and abused and killed. And also, it's weird that the landowner is presented as like a very patient and generous person, but it almost seems kind of foolish because after a group of servants get sent, he sends some more after they get killed, and you almost expect a different result, but you're like, why are you sending all these servants? And then he says he's going to send his son, and you're like, please don't send your son. And so they kill the son, and the son kind of represents a little bit closer of a relationship to the landowner, almost like an extension of the landowner. And so you're thinking, well, surely they're going to respect his son, right, in the same way the landowner did. And what's also funny about the way Jesus tells stories very consistently is that he tells parables of a group of people or a person that does something, he does it one more time, and then the third one's like a reversal. It kind of is unexpected. An example of this would be like the Good Samaritan. And so we're going to keep reading. Verse 40 and 41, Jesus says, "Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants?" And the audience, they say, "He will bring those wretches to a wretched end," they replied. "And he will rent the vineyard to other tenants who will give him his share of the crop at harvest time." So we see Jesus, again, characteristically letting his audience kind of speak their own consequences on themselves of what is due. And these are some very severe words. They're going to bring those wretches to their wretched end. We're going to keep reading. Jesus said to them in verse 42, "Have you never read in the scriptures, 'The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes.'" Jesus here is quoting from Psalm 118, 22, and 23. This is actually one of the halal psalms, which I think there's 5 of them. And from what I read, this was one of the most frequently meditated and recited psalms in the temple, but specifically during the time of Passover, which is pretty convenient. And so Jesus is really doing something risky here. And so the psalm is talking of like these different builders who are looking for the best stone almost for a building. I know I one time went to a Home Depot and was looking for like some wood one time. And I was like looking for a piece of wood when I was reading this. It reminded me of this. I was looking for a piece of wood that didn't have like any knots or like cracks or scuff marks on it. And so I was like, oh, I know where this is going. And so in the same way, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And so that's just kind of this reversal that the one that they didn't think was significant actually is the one that is setting the whole foundation and is holding the weight of the entire structure. And that's the cornerstone. And so Jesus is alluding to this psalm. And so there's a lot of wordplay going on here. I won't get into all of that. But I think it's interesting how the stone in the verse that Jesus quotes is rejected and it becomes the cornerstone. Right? There's this reversal. And in the parable, the son in the parable is rejected by the tenants, right? And then the Son of God, who is clearly Jesus, is being rejected by the tenants of Israel, right? And so we see how the Jewish leadership has rejected the sent Son of God. I'm going to read verse 43 and 44. Jesus says, "Therefore," so previously because of all of these things, "I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people who will produce its fruit. And anyone who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone whom it falls on will be crushed." And I think the kingdom of God is going to be given to certain people who will produce its fruit. That's what this whole thing's about. The word ethnos or ethne here has kind of been tricky. Sometimes that word can mean nation or people. I think most scholars agree that this word is not meaning necessarily is going to be transferring from Jewish to Gentile necessarily, but instead I think Matthew is communicating that Israel's leadership has not stewarded God's vineyard and made good fruit. And so Jesus, God's son, is the one who's ushering in God's kingdom and is kind of emerging a new entity or a new group of people who are going to be transformed by the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so Jesus, God's son, will be the cornerstone of this new movement, the kingdom of God. And this new people will produce good fruit of righteousness and justice and flourishing that wasn't done in Israel at the time of Isaiah, and it's definitely not happening now. And so this goes to the fig tree that Robert just mentioned. This also is consistent as well with the language in verse 44 about this stone, crushing anyone who falls, broken to pieces, and whom it falls will be crushed. This language kind of evokes Daniel 2 language with Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the stone being crushed to chaff and how the only thing remaining will be the kingdom of God. And so this is all kind of headed towards what Jesus is talking about, the way of flourishing through Jesus. And so in verse 45 and 46, the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parable, and they knew immediately he was talking about them. They looked for a way to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowd because the people held that he was a prophet. So I think if we have eyes to see and ears to listen, we'll see that I think the moral of this, what Jesus is getting at is that in the same way, the leadership of Israel at the time is not stewarding the land well, the vineyard of Israel. And so Jesus is going to come and restore the proper fruit from it. And I think to us, it's also a message of everything that we have is a gift of grace. And so in the ways in which we steward the things that God has entrusted to us is super important because it matters the fruit that we bear for the God's kingdom.